There's a place He comes to me. Though I'm blind, He helps me see. Though I see dimly in this place, one day I'll see Him face to face.
This is Kurt Kaikkonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Face to Face, we'll be in the book of Genesis. So grab your Bibles and let's get started. If you want to hear this complete message in its entirety, go to yourneighborhoodchurch.com, where you can download Your Neighborhood Church app at the App Store. And these Ishmaelite traders, they would have gone to the city where the Pharaoh lived, because that's where they would have got the greatest demand for their goods. And their goods were mostly spices and balms and myrrhs, because we read that in the last chapter. But this time, they would also have a slave to sell. And in Egypt, there would have been a lot of Semonite slaves like Joseph. And so he would have been taken down to the slave market, and he would have been naked or nearly naked. And the interested buyers, they would have come and they would have poked him and they would have prodded him like they were buying a horse or a mule or like trying to buy a used car, because they would want to see how much they would be able to get out of him. How much labor could they get? Would it be cost effective for his service? And so they would have checked his teeth to see if any of them were missing, and they would have looked for any type of physical injuries or any type of abnormalities. And now from Joseph's perspective, it would be hard for him to see that God was still leading him in his life, because this doesn't seem much like the dreams he had of his brothers bowing down to him. And naturally, he would have had some doubts. But God, He is leading his life, because God is teaching Joseph how to be a slave and how to be a servant. And if you've read anything about the history of Egypt, you would know that Egyptians treated their slaves harshly. And Joseph, he could have been sold to anybody, and he could have been used for anything, any type of labor. But Joseph was sold to Potiphar. And I believe that Potiphar, his first name was Harry. He was Harry Potter-fur. But really, Potiphar means devoted to the sun. So this man, Potiphar, he had a great suntan. And in those days, they had no tanning booths and they had no spray tans. But like many today, he was a suntanner and he was devoted to the sun. But Potiphar, he was also devoted to Pharaoh. Potiphar was Pharaoh's captain of the guards. And the idea behind being the captain of the guards is like being the chief of police. He was in charge of Pharaoh's personal security force. And like all the officers of the Pharaoh, the word officer is synonymous with the word eunuch, because these men being altered like that, they would have been made exclusively dedicated to Pharaoh to do his work. They would have no other desires to do anything else but to serve their master. But this doesn't necessarily mean that Potiphar was a eunuch, because this term was also used for everyone that was in Pharaoh's court. And these terms were used interchangeably. And so by God's grace, Joseph has been placed into this great man's household. And although Joseph doesn't understand God's path for him, Joseph, he doesn't abandon God, and God doesn't abandon him. And this reminds me of how the Apostle Paul, how he was told that he would speak before kings, but God just didn't tell him the part that he would be doing it as a prisoner of Rome. And so Joseph, he settles down into this household, and God prospers Joseph. And Joseph's master, well, he likes him, and he sees the great potential in this young man. And you have to remember, Joseph, when he got there, he was only 17 years old. And the more Joseph is given to do, the more he succeeds. And even Potiphar acknowledges that it's the Lord, that the Lord is with him. And so Potiphar, he keeps giving Joseph more and more responsibility, and he puts him in charge of the whole household. And you do get that sense that Potiphar, that he really likes this young foreigner that he bought. And you'd think that he was watching Joseph and he brought him home and he sees this Hebrew and he's just learning to speak Egyptian and he spoke with this Hebrew accent. And even though he was a slave, Potiphar may have thought of him more as like a protege or maybe even like some type of adopted son, because maybe Potiphar wasn't able to have sons if he was a eunuch. And if that's so, that might be all there was in that household. Might have been only slaves and Mrs. Potiphar. And Joseph being placed as the head of all the household, and it says that he was also over all the fields, which means that he would have been over Potiphar's investments, all his agriculture, his crops, and maybe there was even some herds. And if Joseph was over those activities, he already had some experience from his father's house. But this would have been a much bigger enterprise because of the kind of man that Potiphar was. So Joseph here, he's getting quite an education. And he's not only getting an education of how Egypt works, but he's also getting an education in how it is to act in a royal household, how to act around royalty and around politicians, and how to serve them and how to speak to them. And he's learning how they think because he's listening to all their conversations and he's learning their customs, their etiquette, down to the little practical things of what side of the plate to put the silverware on and who do you serve first. And all these things that common Egyptians, the regular citizens, that they wouldn't know. And this is probably the only way that somebody from the outside would have gotten this kind of education, by observing them and by practicing it every day, day after day, until it becomes second nature to him, until he becomes comfortable in all these ways. And so Joseph, he became a great servant to Potiphar. And now Joseph, he might be thinking here in his meditations and in his prayer, okay, Lord, I see what you're doing. You're making me into someone great. You're teaching me how to be successful and how things actually work in the real world. Okay, I can see how those dreams you gave me might, fit in here. And this whole time, even when Joseph didn't understand, he trusted God and he believed God and he walked with God. And he still believed that those dreams that he had were from God. But through most of it, no one would have ever have been able to make sense of it. But now it seems like it's coming together and it's starting to make sense. And Joseph, he wasn't in that household for just a little while. He was there for up to 11 years. And the kind of things that he was learning, they would take that kind of time. And toward the end of Joseph's stay in Potiphar's house, Joseph would have been around 28 years old because he started there when he was 17. And now we're told that Joseph was very handsome and he was actually called beautiful. And the Bible only calls 2 adult men beautiful besides Joseph, and that was King David and that was his son Absalom. And so you have this young man, and he's walking around the house like Brad Pitt in his prime, and he speaks fluent Egyptian with all the sophistication of a Cary Grant. And he's a well-dressed man. In fact, he's a perfectly dressed man because he has to be, because of the type of people that they entertained in that home, because they were Pharaoh's people. They were the elite. They were the people who ruled Egypt. But all Mrs. Potiphar can do is stare at Joseph and drool with desire for him, because he was way better looking than all the actors in the Egyptian soap operas back then. And she's totally infatuated with him. But she has a real problem because she's a married woman. And Mrs. Potiphar being married to Mr. Potiphar, well, that wasn't really doing it for her because it's not the way it is in her dream life. That's not what she wanted when she was laying around on her couch daydreaming all day, because she was young and she was very attractive. She was like Angelina Jolie or maybe a Jennifer Aniston. And she, in her dreams, can see herself with a man like Joseph. Because you see, Mr. Potiphar, he may or he may not be a eunuch, but one thing we do know about Mr. Potiphar is that he's older, because you wouldn't be captain of the guard without a lot of experience. And so he was probably craggy, and he was rough, and he was tough, and he was kind of like dirty Harry Potter. And he was a warrior. And he was actually a warrior of warriors. He was like special forces, except he's more like a general. And so maybe he looked more like John Wayne in True Grit. And maybe he has scars and a patch over one of his eyes and leathery skin. And maybe a couple of his teeth have been knocked out. But there's one thing that's true about powerful men. No matter how they look, they always have beautiful wives. They have trophy wives. So day after day, Angelina Jolie, she's saying to Joseph, Joseph, can't you come sit with me over here on the couch? And Joseph would say, Mrs. Potiphar, I'm only up here to bring up the towels. And Angelina would say, Joseph, just love me. And this went on for years and years. And it wasn't because she wasn't beautiful, because she was. But he couldn't do it because he believes that God has something better for him. Because he knows that if he commits this sin, and this is obvious sin because this is adultery, that God wouldn't be able to use him in the way that God wanted to use him, and he would lose his great calling. And Joseph, he wouldn't trade that for anything. So Joseph, he never acted on this, and he never encouraged it. And he explains it very well to her. He says that he couldn't because of his love for God. But that doesn't mean that Joseph wasn't tempted. I'm sure he was, because he was a normal young man. And he could have gotten away with it in the sight of men. But he knew that he would never get away with it in the sight of God, because he really believes in God. And that's why God can use him. And that's why God can lead him. And that's why God can even trust him in this place. So loving God is Joseph's first reason not to sin. But Joseph has a second reason not to sin, and that's because Joseph loves Potiphar. Because Potiphar, he gave him everything. When Joseph had absolutely nothing, Potiphar saved Joseph's life.
You've been listening to Face to Face. Face to Face on this radio station has been provided by Your Neighborhood Church. If you want to help support Face to Face and put this program on other stations just like yours, you can contact us at yourneighborhoodchurch.com or write Your Neighborhood Church, P.O. Box 500, Romeo, Michigan 48065.
There's a place he comes to me. Though I'm blind, he helps me see. Though I see dimly in this place, one day I'll see him face to face.
Tune in again tomorrow at this same time as we continue to go through the Bible.